alive. Drive sober.
You're watching Rogers TV.
This episode of Food Bites is an awesome one because we're talking with two different partners that the food bank has worked with. And one is with the Middlesex-London Food Policy Council. And they have been so awesome. We've worked with them from the very beginning. And they partner with us. We have somebody from the Food Policy Council on the board of the food bank, and we always make sure that that slot is filled with somebody from the Food Policy Council because it's that important to us. We don't want the emphasis just to be on hunger, but on nutrition and education and those other things. And there's nobody better than the Middlesex-London Food Policy Council to do that. It's maybe our main partnership, and we've really enjoyed it. But you're going to meet someone as well who's from Indwell, and we all kind of know who Indwell is these days, working to provide safe environment and housing and security for people that are in vulnerable conditions. And we are partnering with Indwell at the moment on Project Soho, which is a huge investment in this community and also across the country. They know of it. And the food bank is invested in that because part of what we see is they're working on affordable housing, and we see that as a solution in a way in which people don't need food banks. So today we are pretty lucky because we have Lakusiak here in the middle, looking much better than me. And we also have Keisha Joseph, who's here. She's from Indwell. Now, the Food Policy Council is working on this thing about the Food Champion campaign, and I know it runs for a period of time. I think is it April 18th it starts? Is that correct?
Actually, it's already started on the 16th, Glen.
Oh, on the 16th, okay. And then it runs through till May, but that's a great thing to talk about. So why don't we just get into that? I appreciate you both coming on today because I think it's an important campaign. But I'm going to leave it to you, whoever thinks they're the best to answer these questions. But I would like to know more about the Food Champion campaign. When did it start, and what is it that you're trying to do?
Do you want me to start, Keisha?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, the Food Champion campaign kind of started in the early, I'm going to say 2020, maybe before that. 2019, I think we might have had our first one. And then we took a little break during COVID. But the whole goal of this is to profile all the great work that's happening in Middlesex, London around food. So it's anything around food. And we've got so many champions and so many people that are making a difference. And we wanted to highlight those and do it through this campaign. So what we do is we ask for people to nominate someone who's a mover and a shaker, who's a entrepreneur, or someone who's working in agriculture, anything around food, and why they're making a difference. So we run this campaign. We've done it this is the fourth year we've done it. And last year I think we had 13 champions that we profiled and that we honored. And we run this campaign for a couple of weeks, well, about 5 weeks, where we ask people to nominate someone. And the big reason why we do this, Glenn, is because we did a community food assessment in 2022. And one of the big things that we learned from that, as we learned in the original one in 2016, was there is a lot happening around food in Middlesex County and in the City of London. But it's not well known, and we don't all know what good is being done, and all the players that are making a difference in having us get towards a more sustainable local food system, and all the things that they do that are so innovative and so creative and so cool, that we really felt that this was a good way to continue with this campaign to highlight those people.
I think that's vital because it's so much of the knowledge about food that's taken place in recent years has been around food insecurity. So it's about people that are going hungry or families that are having trouble accessing food. And now, of course, it's about the price of groceries and how difficult all this. So that has tended to dominate much of the discussion of food in the city. And that is a real shame because just as you're saying, Ellen, there is a lot going on around food that just doesn't make it into the media or whatever. Now, is it a public health dietitian? Is that what you are, Ellen?
That's correct. Yes, I work at the Middlesex-London Health Unit as a public
That's right. But you're also, the kind of coordinator of the Middlesex-London Food Policy Council, correct? So, and you've been there for a while doing all of that. Does it frustrate you at times, and this is before I move on to Keisha, does it frustrate you at times that so much attention gets paid to some of these other things and not to some of the innovation that's taking place? Or do you kind of see it, look, it's the way that it has to be because times are just tough right now? How do you view that?
Yeah, and you know what? It's come up in so many conversations that we've had as a Food Policy Council, but also at the health unit too, right? Because we get so many requests to be involved in food security initiatives, and we can't really be that. The way that we can do it is through my role as coordinator for the Food Policy Council, because there's just so much more involved than that food security or household food security, whereas the Food Policy Council is really looking at community food security, which involves all of those other pieces that is not just about access to food. Well, it is about access to food, but what does that look like? And there's just so much around. There's so much advocacy that we can do. It's all about land use planning and how do we have more urban ag and community ag, or through community gardens perhaps, or what initiatives in food literacy, food education, all of those pieces, and food sovereignty and people's access and being able to have control over their food. And how can we have more local food? And how can we make that more accessible to people? What do we do about food waste? I mean, it's not just about having a green bin, right? It's about, gleaning, and how can we take more of what's not used and distribute it among everyone, not just those that can't afford to buy food. Sometimes gets frustrated for us as dietitians, but also as the Food Policy Council, because we get pegged in that corner of being responsible for that other area of food security.
Yeah.
So there is more work that we need to do. And I think having this Food Champion campaign helps to highlight that all the other factors that go into having community food security.
And Keisha, this is where you come in. I mean, you're the food program coordinator for Indwell, but you're also really keenly interested in this whole Food Champion thing. Why do you do it? What is the purpose of it? I know it brings recognition, but what else does it do?
I think that it highlights a lot of the resources that are available to all of the different people and communities that we have. With the work that I do support a lot of those who are low income and have various struggles, and supporting them with food security. But we lean very heavily on these resources that are available and using them to help support the people that we do at Indwell. So what I like about the Food Champions is that it highlights all of these things that exist within the community to make it easier for not just, organizations like us that use them, but then also, families and other people who may need some more food security support than kind of the ones that we typically think of, and learn about all the different things. I think it also highlights the different areas, as Ellen said, of the food system, because it's not just a focus on, the food bank or people that are right then and there helping at the kind of end stage where we're buying the food or eating the food or cooking the food, but we also focus on, the people who are growing the food, so farmers and people like that, and then also the distribution portion, so people who are helping getting the food from, the farms to the grocery stores or wherever. And then all the people in between that help with the environmental piece, like Ellen said, about food waste. One of the organizations that I think of that was a food champion last year is the Wormery. And something that we really want to focus on is letting everybody know that you don't have to work directly with food in the sense of, like I said, cooking or, selling, but there are so many stages in the food system that you can work within to be a food champion. And we want, all of those people to have their opportunity to be promoted and shine with the Food Champions campaign.
Yeah, I think that that's a hard job. It's a tough job for kind of three areas. One, traditional media has really shrunk, right? It's not collapsed, but it's not what it used to be. And it's very hard for local media folks when there's only a few camera people, there's only a few videographers, a few reporters, and it's tough to get around to everything. They understand the importance of this stuff, but they just don't have the bench strength that they used to have as media. The other thing we've already talked about, how it tends to be what the emergency things are. That tends to be what captures the attention. But I also think in the third piece, there's just so much happening around food that there's actually not a lot of coordination with all that information. And that's to me, a big part of the problem. So I was talking with Will Heeman, for instance. He was on the show, this last one on Food Bites. But I was saying I knew this family that had gone to a place in Niagara Falls that had the big swimming pools and all that kind of stuff, and their kids just had a blast, right? So they were there for the weekend. The next weekend, they went out to Heeman's, right? And they spent a day there. But when it was all over, the kids were all over their parents. They wanted raised bed garden. They wanted the possibility of getting a greenhouse in their backyard, wanting to learn more about nutrition and other things at school. So, I mean, there is that element where there's a natural hunger for this stuff, and I use that word symbolically, but it is a real hunger within the community for more knowledge about food, not just how do they grow, but what is best for people to consume, what is local, what happens with food waste, for instance, what are the innovative technologies that take place, like as you said about the wormery last year, all of that stuff is there and it's available, but it's everywhere and it's nowhere. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a real concern for us as a food bank, and we see those things as solution-based. Right? Whereas just donations to a food bank or homeless groups or whatever it is, all those things are very important and we have to do it. But often the solutions come in a better workable knowledge about food and how it works in our community. So I really hear what you're saying there, Keisha, the ability to be able to emphasize these other areas and what needs to be done. But it must be frustrating for both of you, but Keisha, this is directed to you, to have trouble getting it out there so that people actually know it and that it's taking place. Does that kind of flummox you sometimes?
Yeah, I would say so. It's interesting, like I said, in the work that I do a lot of food security support for low-income folks, but even interacting with other people in the community that maybe aren't even familiar with what Indwell does, the limit on, their knowledge around what is available to them and what a food system is and what goes into, when you go to the grocery store, what has happened, way before that to even get that there, and all the people that have, developed technology, like you said, or different ways that we can make sure that we're shopping locally or doing stuff with food waste to make sure that it's, we're reducing that, and all the important steps there. So It's nice because I get to have those conversations and, provide some education, but it can be a bit frustrating at times for sure.
I'm sure. Ellen, you and I have talked about this so many times. We've been friends for years, and you work well with Jane at the Food Policy Council. I know that, but sometimes some of these things have trouble registering because of other things. So a good example would be when we decided to donate heavily with Indwell and the partners at South Street for Project Soho. Part of the reason why we did that was because a survey had been done of that area, and at one point or another, 70% of the people that lived in that area had come to the food bank. Right? And we look at that and go, that's not really what we want. We want people to be able to, not have to come to the food bank, that their conditions are of such that they can provide their own food security, make wise choices, so on and so forth. So sometimes it's hard for food to register in that sense, I think, because of things like people who are on Ontario Works or people who are on Ontario Disability really haven't had an increase in a decade. right? Or we talk about the price of rent, cost of rent, or we talk about the price of food. So often choices people make about food, even though they want to make knowledgeable choices, sometimes they're stuck because of these other circumstances. They don't have the income, or they might not live in a place that provides them the kind of access that they need to be able to get good food. I know we've talked about this before, but I think that's one of the main frustrations for me for being at the food bank, is that often the choices that are made are often usurped or eclipsed. I'll use that word because we had that, are often eclipsed because of all of these other issues. How does the Food Policy Council, which is responsible for all of it, how do you direct that? What do you do?
Well, as you're speaking, there's a few things that I'm thinking. When we were talking about the food champions, and when you were talking about those kids that ended up going to Hemans and wanted to, I think part of that is it's addressing it from a non-emergency way, but also from an emergency way when it comes to climate change, because I think that food is one of those pieces that gets missed in the whole climate change conversation. And the only way that we're going to progress in making people feel less afraid and less worried about it is to get them involved and starting at a young age, obviously. And we had food champions last year that were 2 children that were doing stuff in their garden, and they love to do that. And I think that's part of it. It's that food literacy piece that we need to make part of everything we do. And that's where we function as a food policy council, to make sure that that piece is not forgotten. And the environmental piece is really important to us too. It's about policies, maybe, Glenn, but maybe that's not the right name for us. Really what it is advocating for these kinds of things to be happening in the community, and how can we be a leader in coordinating that's happening. And the Food Champions is just one way we do that, but a lot of it is partnership building and working with those people that are doing the work. But how can we make sure that that conversation is heard, and that we're on the tables where the decisions are being made, so at city council or in the county with our county representation as well, because it's really important that both the county and the city support each other in terms of the changes that are happening because of the environment, and the changes that are happening because of food costs, and the changes that are happening because of all the other things, right, that we've had to go through in the last few years. It just seems like it's not getting better, it's getting worse. But we can't always deal with everything as like we did during COVID. We were dealing with an emergency, right? And we had to deal with that but I think we just have to look at it as being, we've got to solve these problems with a long-term lens. And the only way we do that is to work together and to coordinate. And I think that's the role that the Food Policy Council plays.
Yeah, and I want to do another session on that, Ellen, really bad, because I think that the Food Policy Council is the most important thing that we could do around food in this community. Because if we don't do it, all we have are 1,000 voices all out there with a lack of coordination. Places like the city, whether it's politicians or staff, the administration, looking at something like, what do you do about food waste? They often don't have all the information that's required. Right? I think that's really important. Keisha, this gets back to, I think, the food champion stuff. But I remember when the food bank first started, it was media 24/7, right? This was 39 years ago. And Jane and I were doing our best to manage it. I was a firefighter. She had just graduated from Western. But the media loved it and came right onto it. And all of a sudden, education around food really began to happen through the community. And it was great. But once again, it was about emergency. I would have to think that part of your goal for what you're doing around the food champions is actually one of recognition. It's one of letting the community know, we know it's hard, and we know we've been through a pandemic, and we know all about food security and people that are coming to the food bank and other places. But actually, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of funding and investment, even from governments, companies, and others. I would have to think, though, that part of your goal is not just making sure that those people do okay, but this community understands there's more to food than what they're just seeing right now. Do I have that right, or have I overemphasized that?
No, I think you're 100% correct. And I like what you said because it makes me think of hope, right? I think, like you said, given the pandemic, rising food costs, climate change, all of these things that are impacting the food system, food security, I think that Food Champions gives people hope as well. And maybe, they don't need the resources that we are highlighting, or maybe, they don't have the means for some reason to support these organizations or businesses, but at least they can know, there are still people out there that care and are trying their best to change the food system, improve the food system, and make everybody feel and experience better food security.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I feel like it provides some hope for sure.
Can I talk about myself a bit without looking like I'm talking about myself? I wrote a piece in the Free Press this last weekend talking about how 75% of the farms in the country are now gone. In the last 6 decades, that's how much we have lost. 7% of the farmland in Canada is farmed. The rest is not. In southwestern Ontario, we have 4% of the farmable land, the growable land that's in the country, and we produce 26% of the crops. Right? So, there's a lot going on there around food and what needs to be done. But then it kind of got a bit provocative and said the problem with it is, when Confederation happened, 92% of the country lived on farms or lived rurally. Now it's almost 90% live in communities and live in cities. Right? So that's a big part of the problem. The knowledge base that once used to be there, people understanding about food, access to markets, so on and so forth, has really now kind of disappeared. And what you have are a whole bunch of people now living in communities, millions of them, and their choices around food really depend on going to a grocery store or something else, right? The inherent knowledge that Canadians once had about food is not there. But because the population is there, it seems to me that it would be cities that save farming. It would be cities that save agriculture, because that's where the population is. And we're now reaching a point in which the population is now asking for these things. They're asking for fresh food. They're asking for markets. They're asking and pressing the provincial government to put nutritional training within schools, right? So it's happening. And the public is beginning to speak up and wanting it to happen. And that idea of how really we're frustrated because cities have taken over farmland and put out subdivisions, all that is true. It's sad. It shouldn't be that way. I get all that. At the same time, we've got a bulk of people here that continue to support the food bank, that continue to support Indwell, that continue to support the Food Policy Council. But what they want is change. They want change to be able to access this nutritional food, whether they can afford it or not. They want those choices. So it seems to me, Keisha, for what you're doing around the Food Champions, they're actually in the right place. They're, many of them are in the cities, and they're trying to make some of this stuff work. And Ellen, for the Food Policy Council, I know it's Middlesex-London Food Policy Council, but the truth of the matter is the real buying is happening within communities and within cities. And it seems to me that both of this, the Food Champions idea, the Food Policy idea, we might actually be in a sweet spot, but because it's not being recognized yet, it hasn't arrived really in the public consciousness of people, but it's there. 10 years ago, the food bank, 24% of the food we gave out was fresh. This year, it was 56.
Wow.
That didn't come because Jane and I were great leaders. It had nothing to do with that. It came to the fact that people wanted to donate that stuff, and they wanted to make sure that people had that kind of food, that quality of food. So I do think we're there, but policymakers and decision makers and even some leaders are not yet there. They're not realizing that the public is behind all of these things. Do you think I'm speaking out of left field on this, or do you have, both of you, do you have the feeling that that might be true? Do you sense that might be true, or do you think, no, it's a long time coming yet?
I think so. I think that, people are aware of the kind of gaps in food security and food systems and want to fill them the way that they can. And I think that part of what the council does and Food Champions does is trying to be a voice for the people, the public, to those policymakers and people who can kind of put things in place to make these changes more permanent and support the communities better. But yeah, I would definitely say in my experience and conversations, and even the Food Champions, I think, is a great example. People are going out of their way to nominate folks that they see are making a change and doing something within the food system is alone a perfect sign that people want change and want to help.
Yeah. Ellen?
Yeah, and I think people want to get involved, right? And I think this is a way for them to find out what is happening and where they can make a difference too, and learn about things. But we had such interesting champions last year, such a diversity of. We had the pollinator team, and we had. I'm trying to remember the name of the gal out in here. Let me just look it up. Danielle from the ranch. She was doing Danielle Riley doing pet food. She was making pet food available from waste, and and just so many cool things that that they're all trying their in their own little way. And I think that's what people need to learn, right? And they'll feel better about the food system and what's happening and what's coming at them and what's happened in the past by feeling like they're part of change and part of making a difference. And that makes a huge impact on people.
Yes, and I think the public has a chance to actually enter into this. Often they don't, but with the Food Champions, they do. So, Keisha, I think it started the 16th, I think is what Ellen said, but it runs right through to the end of May, correct? And people can nominate these very champions that we're talking about here. How do they do that? How would they go about to nominate someone?
So they can find the nomination form on the council website if they just search Food Champions on there. And then they can also see the previous Food Champions from the last few years and maybe hopefully get an idea of kind of, who they might want to nominate. They can also look on the council social media as well, which I believe we have the links there, which is an option as well.
Yeah, and I'll put that link up on this as well so people will have it. But, we're talking about creating change, and here's something in which people can, the average person, the neighbor, me, whatever, we can sign on to that. It's our way of letting decision makers and others know we see, we understand, and we want these kind of things prioritized. Ellen, you and I have been around a long time partnering together. Keisha, I'm so glad that you're part of all of this as well. But we need to have another talk, and I'm almost going to insist on one, not that I can, because it's up to you. But this whole Food Policy Council, the whole clearinghouse idea of if you want to know something about food, how much is wasted, how much is collected, what's the climate emergency action plan around food, all of those go, what's a food assessment? Like apparently the Middlesex-London Food Policy Council has one. What is it? How does it work? We need to have that type of talk. So let's do another show or two maybe before the summer if we can. I'm happy to talk to the two of you. It'd be wonderful. I'll leave it up to you folks. But the public, it's not enough to come to a food bank to get that. It's not enough to wait for some big crisis to happen. We have to insist on the changes that we want here. And the Food Policy Council is the one place we need to go, the one-stop shop where we have all of that information. And part of the problem is it's not being supported the way that it needs to be. That's really true, and we might as well tell the truth. So the food bank has decided to invest heavily in the Food Policy Council over the course of the next 5 years because we want that. The public is cramming for information about food, and this is our way of doing it. Are you two up for that? I think we should talk about it lots.
Okay. Keisha, are you on board? Okay.
Thanks for doing this. You two really appreciate it. And then we'll be right back at you in the next few weeks, and we'll just keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Glenn.
Thank you.
Thanks.